It's difficult to say with certainty exactly what triggered the latest wave of violence against foreign nationals in South Africa. Depending on who you believe, the blame either lies with the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, or it lies with the media. Earlier this month, migrants from countries such as Somalia, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and Mozambique all came under attack in Durban after Zwelithini allegedly said that foreigners should pack their bags and go. The king says that his words were taken out of context. He's called for the media to be investigated. And it's not just the Zulu king who has taken exception with the way things are being reported. According to the president, Jacob Zuma, the media are making South Africa look bad. The violence is a big story there, getting lots of coverage, and the headlines scream xenophobia. But does that term really do justice to what is actually happening? Is it really the irrational fear and hatred of foreigners that's driving the violence? Or is it the failure of the government to end the poverty and the inequality of the apartheid era? Our starting point this week is Durban. These were the images South Africans woke up to last Sunday. 3 attackers and 1 victim, Emmanuel Sithole from Mozambique. He was stabbed in the heart and rushed to a clinic by the same journalist who took the pictures. He would eventually succumb to his wounds. And this, according to South Africa's president, is how you make a country look bad. He wasn't talking about the attackers. He was referring to the newspaper that printed the images and told the story.
It was a really difficult decision to be made. I remember when the guys came back with the pictures, everybody in this newsroom was quite shocked. What we considered most was the impact. This violence had been going on for a very long time, and in many of the cases, people do not get arrested, and the police say the people who committed the crime can't be identified. So we thought that would assist in actually nabbing the people who were responsible for the crime. And indeed, 2 days later, the police acted and people were arrested.
That picture there shocked the nation. I mean, if there were any person who was still living in denial, any government official still living in denial, after seeing that picture, the brutality of it, I mean, the important thing is that the Sunday Times and the other newspapers covered it in such a way so we can see for ourselves the brutality.
For President Zuma to say that these graphic images make us look bad, I think it is hypocritical. South Africa already looks bad in terms of not addressing the social inequality that is plaguing this country in post-apartheid era. South Africa is more unequal now today than it was in 1994. Maybe 60 to 70% of the population lives in squalid conditions. And a lot of the violence that is now pouring over to the migrants is an everyday reality in those spaces.
We'd all like to have a country where we don't have such images on the front pages of our newspapers. But the reality is that there is a section of our society that thinks it is okay to attack people because they come from foreign lands and because they are poor. What makes us look bad is when there are more than 300 foreigners killed since 2008, that there's only been 1 conviction for murder. That is what makes us look bad.
The roots of this story go way back and run deep. But this latest eruption followed a speech by the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, who leads the country's largest ethnic group. Speaking from a prepared text, the king said foreigners must pack their bags and go home. Denying any responsibility for what ensued, Zwelithini said if he really wanted foreigners killed, this country would be reduced to ashes. And he called for the media to be investigated for its coverage of his speech. South Africa is seeing an epidemic of violence, and between its president and its Zulu king, it's suffering a contagion of blaming the messenger.
At first he said he was misquoted. Then the media produced a recording of his speech, which was very carefully translated. There's now no suggestion that the media were inaccurate, only that they quoted it out of context, and I just don't see the evidence. So I think it's fine to have an investigation, but I think much more important is to call the king to account for his behavior, for his lack of responsibility, and for his slow response when violence broke out.
But maybe the problem was if the headline says the king says certain people must go, it's a headline, and not everybody reads the story that is in the newspaper. But I think most of the reporting, if you actually read the report, was quite responsible. It was quite accurate.
And that really is a problem in our political culture in South Africa is that political leaders don't take responsibility for their actions. You always blame the media, you blame the settlers, you blame the imperialists. So if we don't take responsibility for our actions, we won't be able to deal with our problems. What the king should just do is to apologize about his statements and then to go to the communities and to the victims that have been affected, embrace those people and promise to protect him.
The degree of independence in South African media outlets varies depending on the medium. The Zuma government has steadily exerted more and more influence over broadcast news, particularly the state-owned SABC. But newspapers, many of which still have corporate owners, are much more critical of the government. The vast majority of news, though, is still delivered over the airwaves. And on this story, the facts and the pictures are coming up against political authorities who are trying to have the story told their way.
I worry that the government spends so much energy about how the media portrays it, rather than actually get stuck down to the job. The SABC, which is a public broadcaster, is 100% government owned. 75 to 80% of South Africans get their news from the SABC or radio. The newspapers in South Africa most probably only reach about 5% of the population of the country. Why would government worried about 5%? So I cannot see why government would spend so much time and energy about worrying about the media if they control the majority of the media.
The South African authorities also take issue with the terminology swirling around this story. They prefer to call it a wave of criminality rather than xenophobia, especially given that during the apartheid years, many black South African leaders were sheltered by the same countries whose citizens are now under attack. As President Zuma said of the xenophobia label, "I don't think we should use the simple word because it is easy to use excessively. It gives a wrong impression that South Africans are xenophobic. We are not." He called the murder of Emmanuel Sithole purely criminal.
Well, clearly there are criminal acts. Murder is a criminal act. And clearly there are criminals who jump on the bandwagon in order to loot and steal. But there's no doubt that it's directed at people because they are foreigners.
Criminality is a problem in South Africa, but what is problematic for me in terms of how the government is framing it is to talk about this as criminality that only applies to migrants and refugees. It's criminality that was prevalent and existed prior to the attacks against migrants, but that the government has failed to deal with and to address. So these kind of narratives, discourses come over and over again, and people end up believing it.
It's not directed at all foreigners. It's directed at particular foreigners. I think we must call it what it is, which is it's aimed at foreigners. It's therefore xenophobia.
One final note on that stabbing victim. When Emmanuel Sithole was first taken to a clinic fighting for his life, there was no doctor there to help him. The doctor reportedly stayed away from work that day. He is Congolese. He would have seen the coverage and, fearing for his own life, was not there to save another. On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the violence in South Africa.
The decision to publish pictures of xenophobic violence, such as the ones the Sunday Times published, should not be taken lightly. There's the question of the dignity of the deceased, whether black deaths are portrayed with less consideration than would have been the case with white victims. There's the possibility of such images fanning violence, and the very presence of photographers on the scene may also influence how these events play out.
Xenophobia is not a pretty issue, and this is not the time for President Zuma to be concerned about what is pretty, what is good PR, and what is not. The situation is actually that bad. This kind of media coverage is exactly what we need.
We're always open to viewer feedback and ideas. If you've got an opinion on the news media, just go to our Facebook or Twitter page. Our Twitter handle is @AJListeningPost. Then fire up your camera, make a worthwhile point, hit send, and we'll see you on the download.